Welcome back to Morning Live. Now, spanning decades of and encompassing war, mass exodus, epic migrations, and the search for individual and collective identity, The Last Earth tells the story of modern Palestine through the memories of those who have lived it. Ordinary Palestinians rarely narrated their own history. Now, in this book, Ramsey Baroud draws on dozens of interviews to produce vivid, intimate, and beautifully written accounts of Palestinians' lives all over the world. Is empathetic and lyrical dimension of the saga, telling the whole scenario like never before. Against dominant narratives, this book reclaims Palestine's past and present for all its people. Right now, I'm joined by Ramsey Baroud, who is with me in studio, the author of The Last Earth. And trust me, the book has so much emotional angle. He's a Palestinian, of course, and as I can mention to you, he's gone through so much to come and write this book, and also the painful bit that was also involved in this. Ramsey, good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to Switch TV. And welcome to Kenya also.
Thank you.
All right. Now, when you talk about The Last Earth, yes, a very powerful book. I've managed to read the book until somewhere in the middle, and I can say that there's so much emotional angle on this book. There's so much conflict in this book. But what drove you to come up with the Last Earth?
Right. First of all, thank you for having
welcome.
me. I appreciate being here, and for you to take notice of this particular type of narratives, because unfortunately people's narratives in general tends to be marginalized in favor of political cliche-driven narratives, not just about Palestine, but most conflicts, whether in the Middle East or Africa. And that's really the idea here behind the book, is I'm saying let's try to change the conversation for once. Let's not talk about politics in its classical cliche-driven sense, and let's talk to the people, because ultimately any history is really driven by the people who are living that history. Believe it or not, it's not the Israeli government only or the Palestinian Authority only that is really determining the dynamics of the realities in Palestine and Israel, but the people as well. And yet they have been the most marginalized actors. So the challenge here is, how do you talk to ordinary people and try to exact from them the kind of narrative that, if it's placed together, it will be able to knit and reproduce a whole new way of looking at history. This is what we call people's history, or history from below. And it is something that we need in the South in particular, because our histories have been dominated either by neocolonialism or by elitist interpretation of our history to the people that the masses and ordinary people are completely neglected and marginalized.
Okay. Do you think Israeli attack on Palestine is all about territory, expanding the territory, and boiling down to colonialism? In Kenya, in the 1950s and 60s, as I mentioned, Mau, they fought for their own independence in the country, other countries in Africa. Do you think also, with the fact that retaliation is part of your recipe also, do you think you're fighting for independence? And also Israeli trying to expand the territory?
What is happening in Palestine is a classical case of colonialism in its most traditional, raw, early 20th century manifestation. That is what's happening. It's the last traditional colonial regime in that sense. And Palestinians, maybe we don't state this enough, and I think we should. We do look at South Africa, we do look at Kenya, we look at Tanzania, we look at Angola, we look at the South in general to draw inspiration, because we feel, and we are right on this, that you have been through our own history. The concentration camps, the ethnic cleansing, the apartheid, the colonialism in all of its forms. You've been through it in earlier parts of your history, and you achieved your independence. And we are trying to get to that point in our history as well.
Palestine is occupied by most Israeli. I thought this was a conflict.
It's not a conflict, and that's one of the issues that needs to be discussed. This is part of why the book is here, and many other books by other Palestinians. We need to reclaim our narrative. The language is so very important. This is not a conflict. There are no moral equivalence between a nation that is oppressing another and the nation that's fighting back. Israeli violence that is killing and wounding tens of thousands of people in Gaza right now cannot be compared to the resistance tactics that are used by Palestinians to break the siege and to achieve their freedom.
Okay. Now let's talk about the young people. They're very instrumental in just the resisting the occupation. We call it the first intifada. Was actually led by the young people. Do you think right now, you know, when the globe kind of just watches news around the world, there's been a rocket in Gaza Strip and 3 Palestinians have been injured, dead for that matter. Now, the young people, intifada for that matter, do you think they still have that power to fight for that occupation? As much as you say it's independence, there's some aspects of also arbitration in it. What do you think?
Absolutely. I think many years ago, the Palestinian people, our ancestors, were faced with this question. And it's a question that the Zionists want to be solved in favor of them moving on with their lives, melting into the masses of the Middle East. And because there's this racist perception that Palestinians are not a unique nation, they don't have an identity of their own. Yet there was this decision that I don't credit my generation with it, I credit my grandfather's generation with it, and that is, we will not submit. Maybe the military powers between us and our enemies are so great for us to achieve a military victory in the traditional sense, but there will be no submission and we are going to resist. And I think that legacy of resistance that started in the 1920s and 30s of the last century is still the same driver for resistance of this young generation that is in Gaza today, challenging Israeli snipers at the fence separating the besieged Gaza Strip from apartheid Israel. It is the same spirit of resistance that's still going through our nation for the last 100 years.
We've had world leaders coming in to condemn so many things because at the end of the day, Palestinians are also retaliating to Israeli. When Israeli kind of have the same feel, they come in big numbers and actually retaliate even big time. Now, the world has been watching, and arbitration, trying to negotiate all this has been happening. But still, it's not so consistent. There must be something happening. After 3 months, something happening. Do you think one day we'll get a solution to this?
Of course there will be a solution, but the solution, it will not be an American-style negotiated solution. Every anti-liberation struggle, anywhere in the world, was always won. It was always achieved, exacted by the resistance of the people. Our solution is not going to be an American-led conference in which we find, all the cliches, peace process, painful concessions, and all of these things. What we actually need is for enough pressure to be placed on the apartheid government of Israel, the same way that pressure was placed on the apartheid government of South Africa, in order for them to relent, in order for them to respect international law. Israel is the main country in terms of the number of international UN resolutions that have been violated in the last 70 years. So we need this kind of solidarity and pressure on Israel to relent in order for Palestinians to finally attain their freedom.
All right. So you can send in your feedback on Twitter, SMS lines 22999. Of course, you can pose any question to Ramsey here in studio, and I'll be asking him the question live on air. And something very interesting also. My grandfather, just part of the book, my grandfather assumed he'll be back home in a few weeks. Now, he even asked your grandmother that, why bother hold the good blankets on the back of a donkey, exposing them to the dust of the journey, when we know that we'll return to Beit Daras in a week or so? Well, he asked your grandmother. 70 years on, no one has returned.
Right. And I think my grandfather was under the impression that, and that debate happened, it was a repeat of similar conversations that happened throughout Palestine. It's unprecedented in history that a nation would come and in the matter of weeks would entirely uproot a whole nation of 1 million people and just push them into the sea, push them into the desert and everywhere else in the world. So there was this idea that the international community would never accept this. This was after World War II, after the defeat of Nazism and fascism. So there was this hope that we have an enlightened international community. This injustice would never prevail. Sadly, my grandparents and my parents are now buried in the same refugee camp that they have been pushed to 71 years ago, and yet a new generation is still hoping to go back and perhaps reclaim these new blankets.
There's a question here on Twitter by one Nasir X. Please ask Dr. Ramsey Baroud to comment on the framing of the Palestine question as a Muslim versus a Jew conflict, in quotes. Where do Palestinian Christians stand in this struggle?
It is very important that we create a clear distinction here between the nature of the conflict that is happening in Palestine. I think the intentional misrepresentation of the conflict as a religious conflict gives the impression that this is nothing for the international community to worry about. These are people fighting about religion. Religious wars have been going on for a long time. No, this is a modern political situation created by colonialism. It is no different than any other conflict that existed, not conflict, but rather any other colonial experience that existed in the South throughout the 19th and the 20th century until most of these countries achieved their liberation. So we cannot misrepresent the conflict in Palestine as such. It is also important to know that the Christian community in Palestine is the world's most ancient Christian community. These are the people who were there walking with Jesus Christ all these years ago. They are still the continuation of the ancestors of that community, and they are victimized by this as well. So Muslims and Christians and many Jews, in fact, are fighting for the end of Israeli apartheid and the end of Zionism as an ideology.
Still, some guys still asking Nasir, I would like to know Dr. Ramsey Baroud's opinion about the so-called #deal of the century. What's that?
Right.
Sure.
So the deal of the century is another American political gambit, a charade, that they don't want to put pressure on Israel. They just want to put the pressure on the Palestinians. They don't want Israel to change its tactics or its politics or stop its illegal colonial expansion in the West Bank. So they are constantly trying to come with these ideas in which they want to bribe Palestinians. We'll give you a little bit of money, just let go of your rights. We'll make your economy a little bit better, but you have to concede to the fact that Israel is going to exist as a Jewish state at the expense of the Christians and the Muslims of Palestine. And Palestinians, to the credit of the Palestinian Authority itself, they're saying absolutely not. This is an issue of human rights, an issue of freedom, not an issue of money.
Well, another question right here from Allah Pia says, I would like to know Ramsey Baroud's opinion on the role of PA embassies in amassing support for the Palestinian cause.
And the Palestinian Authority?
Absolutely, sure.
Right, so the Palestinian Authority, as we know, was established after the signing of Oslo, the Oslo Accords in 1994. Initially, they had the role of trying to guide the Palestinians through that moment of independence when we have an independent Palestinian state. Sadly, they have failed. So there is this conflict within Palestinian politics as well. That what do we do now that the Palestinian Authority has failed to achieve that objective? It doesn't mean that Palestinian embassies, whether here in Kenya or anywhere else, cannot play a very important role to convey the message of the struggle and the resistance of their people to the rest of the world.
So personally, when was the last time you're in Palestine?
In 2012.
So what's the situation on the ground so far? Do you feel like there's still so much to be done?
Oh, absolutely. The situation is very difficult because the nature of apartheid is entrenching. The Israeli wall, the apartheid wall that is built throughout the West Bank, isolating Palestinian communities from one another. I need a lot of time to explain to you about the nature of apartheid and how it translates on a daily basis. People not being able to get to hospitals, people dying at checkpoints, people not being able to get to their farms or to their schools. Imagine waking up in the morning, going to your farm to realize that the military has taken over the farm and it has been declared a closed military zone, and you have absolutely no access to it, and there is no court system that is fair enough that would champion your rights whatsoever. This is the reality that every Palestinian in Palestine is going through, whether in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in Bethlehem, or in Gaza.
We've seen so many countries in conflict. The international community comes in very quickly and sorts out all this. But seems like Israeli and Palestine, there's a problem. Is it all about the politics? Of course, you mentioned religion, you've touched on religion, but looking at the politics and the territorial control, and also the fact that the quest for freedom, which one is which, and what's really bring this conflict not to end anytime soon?
Since the very beginning, there has been international consensus on Palestine as far as the international community, and I would like to thank the African countries in particular that have stood up against Zionism and Zionist racism and have offered support for the Palestinian people from the very start until today. But here is the problem. The problem, if you look at the history of UN resolutions, every time the international community tries to enforce a mechanism to change this situation and to bring justice and freedom to the Palestinian people, the Americans always raise their hands in a veto at the Security Council. All these votes are always Israel, the United States, against the rest of the world. And so this is the unfair voting system at the international community, at the United Nations, that have made this so extremely difficult for us. So it's not like because there's the lack of will on the part of the international community or the lack of interest on the part of the international community, is because the Americans have always stood as this massive wall between international law and implementing it in any meaningful way that would make a difference in the lives of Palestinians.
Now, retaliation actually kind of annoys Israeli, who are also saying that they're trying to make this very soft, but retaliation comes in. When we are seeing a Palestinian journalist maybe killed in the line of fire, it's a very unfortunate thing. It goes just like that. The human rights activists all over the world come up in arms, but nothing is done. But still, they go ahead and mention, they try to do this in a very amicable way, but you are retaliating. Is that true?
Well, what annoys Israel about retaliation is the fact they want Palestinians to roll over and die, disappear. The fact that Palestinians are resisting, and they are not just resisting using armed struggle in Gaza, they are resisting, really the majority of the type of resistance used by Palestinians are civil disobedience, non-violent types of methods. But of course, there's always the emphasis on Palestinians are using arms to defend themselves in Gaza. Which, by the way, is permissible under international law. And almost every liberation movement anywhere in the world utilized armed struggles, from Algeria to Angola to South Africa to Kenya to everywhere else. But there is this constant emphasis on that because they are trying to present Palestinians as violent and terrorist. The fact is, Palestinians have since the very beginning been in a state of self-defense. If you look at the numbers of the last Israeli war on Gaza in 2014, for example, nearly 2,500 Palestinians killed, over 10,000 people wounded, vast majority of them were civilians. How many Israeli civilians were killed during that duration of time? About 4 or 5. So we are looking, yet if you watch CNN or other channels, you really get the impression that it's Palestinian violence that's creating this momentum and this hostility, which is actually entirely the other way around.
Now back to the book, The Last Earth. Do you think what you put together in this book will, when a Palestinian reads this book, will actually comfort him or her? Because at the end of the day, I've read this book and there's some sense of homeliness where you want them not even to kind of blame their own society. Do you think it might comfort a Palestinian somewhere reading this book?
Absolutely. In fact, the Palestinians, especially young Palestinians, are one of the major target audience of this book. I want them to know that their history cannot be reduced to this counter history, you know, because Israel says we are terrorists and we are constantly in this, you know, constant state of self-defense. No, let's tell our story the way that it defines us, the way it belongs to us. Let's reclaim it all together.
Yeah.
And I am very happy to report that I have been to, this is the 14th country that I have visited, promoting the book, and everywhere I go I see Palestinians who are very happy and pleased by the outcome of this book and how it truly represents the collective narrative of the Palestinian people.
All right. Now, as we are, of course, about to wind up, it's clear that you've worked with so many people to produce this, and from guys who supervised your PhD, all those people you've thanked here. Now, dissemination of this book back to Palestine, back home, where when someone reads this, will be very proud of a son of the soil who came up with all the ideas, the story that the world needs to know. Do you think now the son of the soil can go back home and confidently supply this book to anyone who is interested and know that indeed one day we'll be liberated?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I think this is the spirit and the message that I'm getting of a new group of Palestinian historians who are also being part of this project of reclaiming ourselves, our identity, and our narrative altogether.
Okay, now there must be a desire, because as an author who's a journalist also, there must be desire. We've talked so much about the conflict, whether it's religious, the youths taking part in the conflict. The whole thing is about, even you're borrowing the whole scenario from African countries. You've mentioned apartheid. You've mentioned even colonialism era, Mau Mau in Kenya. And do you feel like your desires will come to fruition very soon in Palestine?
I don't think apartheid is sustainable. I don't think racism is sustainable. I think it goes against the very nature of human beings. I think we all gravitate towards finding freedom and justice. And I think that day in which Palestinians and Israelis, Muslims, Christians and Jews living together side by side in one democratic, secular state, I think that day is coming, and I think it's going to be sooner than we expect.
Now, Harsh Darling is asking, thank you so much, Nick, for bringing Ramsey on board. I have his book, but there's something I don't understand. Why is the fight not ending anytime soon? Wow, that's a powerful one. Still straight to the point.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. The fight will end. It will end once the consequences, or rather the reasons that created that fight, are no longer in place. For example, you can't expect, we would have never expected that South African resistance to relent if apartheid was still in effect. Apartheid had to be removed. Israeli checkpoints have to be removed. The Israeli army needs to end the killing fields that's happening in Gaza. The siege needs to end. When these conditions are all met, of course the situation is going to become better, and justice will eventually prevail.
Okay. Abdel Karim, I would like to ask Ramsey Baroud if he supports one-state solution or two-state solution to the Palestine-Israel conflict, and why.
I fully support and back the one-state solution. In fact, in some strange way, if you think about it, that solution is already there. Jews, Christians, and Muslims are all living between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. However, we are living according to two different sets of laws, one that favors one group over the other. Once these laws are changed and people are treated equally and people achieve their rights, it's really all the matter of finding a political formula that works for everyone. I think two-state solution was never really intended to work in the first place. I think dividing people based on their race would have never worked in the first place, and I think it's a very unjust solution to start.
Javan the poet says, many have not really understood what is happening between Palestine and Israel. This show will today do great justice to shed light on the great issues that has led to loss of thousands of lives in Palestine. Thank you so much, Javan, for your sentiments. Also, someone else says that you haven't mentioned name. Of course, Romana Rubeo says, which are the tools Palestinians can use in order to impose the narrative as opposed to the colonial narrative which is now dominating.
Right. The storyteller has to be a Palestinian because we are the ones who are able to relate to our narrative more than anybody else. We don't need people to be telling the story on our behalf. But I also need to mention here that this is not just the work of a historian. It's not just the work of a politician. It's also the work of the artist, the storyteller, the dancers, every form, the Palestinians are very diverse and very fascinating people in their cultural production. And we need to engage with people, whether in Kenya or anywhere else in Africa and the rest of the world, as people to people. We need to bring that human dimension as opposed to us always being seen as victims or as aggressors. Rather, we want to be seen and related to at a whole different, in a whole different way.
Okay. Finally, Suraya Dado, Switch TV Kenya, if the lands don't write, then the story will always glorify the brutal hand. Ramsey Baroud is part of a new generation of Palestinian writers bravely telling the story, power to their pens. Thank you so much, Ramsey, for coming. We wish you all the best in the quest to get that land back, in the quest to make sure that that's freedom. And of course, you have to tell us that you are on tour in Kenya, and maybe yesterday you were somewhere, maybe today. What's your program today?
So today I will be speaking at the Amnesty International offices here in Nairobi, and if your viewers can go to my website, ramseybaroud.net, they will find my full schedule. All right. Thank you so much for coming.
Great. I wish you all the best. It's a great honor. All right, we're taking a short break. Conversation continues right in Morning Live, and we'll be back in a few. Stay tuned.